maybe not to give too much time away from your talk, I will just introduce a little bit the platform. Well, hello everyone. My name is Michela, and I'm a scientific project manager in ILSI Europe. But if you looked at the rest of the symposium, I was very often in the lobby, so I'm going to introduce myself anyway. We have the session is titled Personalized Nutrition from Data Collection to Implementation. So welcome to this session, and some notes on this session. So we're going to have 3 speakers and 2 chairs. So the chair is Professor David Vauzour, and the co-chair is Pedro Mena, and 3 different speakers. So we have Dr. Sean Astley, Professor José Ordovás, and Dr. Sarah Berry. About the platform, a little bit in general. So if you want to ask questions, and you're really invited to do so, please do by clicking on this icon. So it's a bubble with a question mark. So here, basically, the speakers will be able to see your questions and answer live at the end of the Q&A session, and use this comment bubble for public chat comments and appreciation. And about appreciation, you will find also at the end of the talk, you can vote on how do you rate the content and the speaker of this session. So I'm going now to give the floor to David and Pedro to introduce the speakers and the rest of the session. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Michela, for this introduction, and welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to share with my colleague, Dr. Pedro Mena, this personalized nutrition session for the ILSI Europe annual meeting. We have a great lineup of speakers. I hope you will enjoy. Pedro, maybe you want to add something here, present yourself, maybe it would be a great idea.
Okay, hello everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here today chatting with David this incredible session on personalized nutrition. That you will see the quality of the speakers is already well known. And we hope you will be able to better understand what are the importance of, for instance, data collection when it comes to personalized nutrition approaches, but also how we can implement personalized nutrition approaches in a very effective way, and not like we see to date many application online resources that are not science-based application, but just commercial ones. Here, I think we will understand how to transform rocket science into effective personalized nutrition approaches. And David, if you want, we can continue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Pedro. Well, without further ado, actually, I think we're going to start up with our first speaker. So the first speaker is Sean Astley. Sean has worked in many organizations for Europe. She is currently a senior researcher and communication manager for the European Food Information Resource, supporting the research as well as training communication activities within EU-funded research projects and networks. She's also an independent science communicator and an editor for the food chemistry and editor-in-chief for the food chemistry molecular science. Today, she's going to talk about delivering scientifically validated resources for personalized nutrition advice, and I hope you will enjoy that talk. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you kindly. Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session. Start off with what are we talking about? So the idea that food and health are linked, and that there is a distinct link between food and health quite clearly, is not new. And that we know that individuals respond differently to the same diets, and the example that's quite often perhaps most well understood is that between cholesterol and saturated fat intake. And when we start to think about personalized nutrition, that doesn't reduce the importance of the general public health suggestions around non-communicable disease and reducing those risks. So we still need to be an appropriate weight for our height. We still need not to be smoking. Consumption of alcohol needs to be in moderation. And we need to be eating the coloured fruits and vegetables, at least 5 portions a day. and we still need to be exercising anything between 75 and 150 minutes for cardio exercise per week, and 2 strength-based exercises per week. So that does not change when we start to talk about personalised nutrition. We have got more precise in the information that we offer through public health. So that's more about eating starchy foods. It's more about eating fish, including oily fish. It's about cutting down on the saturated fats and the free sugars. It's about cutting down on salt. It's about staying hydrated. And there's still some controversy around whether or not we should be eating breakfast, but I think it's largely agreed that that is a good thing. But if you do all of those and you feed the same people, a group of people, the same breakfasts, the same foods, the simple fact is that one size does not fit all, and not everybody will respond in the same way. And then you begin to start to have to look at alternative ways of shaping the diet that individuals are eating. So for the purposes of my talk and subsequent talks, we're going to examine things like stratified or tailored nutrition. So that's about nutritional intervention or advice for groups with shared characteristics, and those shared characteristics I'll elaborate on a little bit more later. But they can be self-defined, or they can be defined in terms of blood results, for example. Confusingly, in the literature, if you go and look at stratified and tailored nutrition, you will also unhelpfully find it called precision nutrition, which I'll get to at the bottom. So in terms of personalised nutrition or individually tailored nutrition, you're talking there about nutritional intervention or advice that's suited to individuals, and it's based on those individuals' goals. It might be weight gain, it might be weight loss. I didn't do that. It might be healthy eating. There are any number of activities that an individual might wish to shape around their food intakes. And it might include their phenotypes, or it might include nutrigenetic analysis. In terms of precision nutrition, there you're talking about dietary intervention or advice based on nutrigenomics. For the purposes of my talk, at least, nutrigenetics is about the modification of a specific component of the diet in response to a genotype for a single gene. In the case of nutrigenomics, that's about characterization of all or some genes, proteins, and metabolites that respond to food or food components with particular metabolic consequences. And the aim is to shape the individual's behaviors, both diet and exercise, to come to an overall benefit on health. So if you're going to do that, if you look just at the beginning with stratified or tailored nutrition, there are certain criteria that we need to fit. In the first place, the groups have to be measurable. So individuals need to be able to say that they belong to a particular group, and then having assigned themselves that group, they can eat according to the advice for that group. So it might be that an individual identifies themselves as apple or pear-shaped, or you can look at finger length in relation to cardiac disease risk. It might be they have a family history of cardiovascular disease or a family history of high cholesterol. It might be they have a fasted glucose that is high, or they have insulin resistance, or their HbA1c results suggest that there is insulin resistance there, or diabetes. Excuse me. The interventions have to reduce the independent risk marker. So in the case of cardiovascular disease, you'd expect to see a reduction in cholesterol. These approaches cannot treat, they are not medicines. They need to have a significant advantage over conventional routes. So that would be, for example, a low-fat diet in this category. And the foods need to be technically feasible. Now, if you take a walk around the supermarket, those kind of foods for stratified and tailored nutrition are already out there. They're foods that have nutritional claims on them: low fat, fat-free, low saturated fat, source of fiber, source of calcium, high in protein, and so on. Or indeed those that have got very specific health claims. So ALA contributing to normal blood cholesterol, and there are other examples. In terms of personalising nutrition advice, this time it's the individual who has to be measurable rather than a group, and that may be based on their height or their waist and hip measurements, their biochemistry, their exercise, or indeed their sleep patterns. It might be related to their goals or their motivations. It might be their family history. It might be food allergies or intolerances or a specific genotype. Again, they need to have a significant advantage over conventional routes. Simply saying eat less, move more. They've got to be able to do better than that, which actually on consideration is probably not that hard. They can't claim to prevent or to treat a disease, and the process this time needs to be technically feasible. We know that personalised advice is more effective. Food for Me is just an example of one project in Europe that has successfully proven that you will see larger, more appropriate changes in diet, and those are more persistent than other methods of changing people's dietary behaviour. What is not clear is whether or not personalised advice is more successful because it's engaging human to human, even if it's delivered via an electronic device, or whether it is actually the personalized advice that has the bigger difference. How might we achieve some of these aims? Well, we have the Internet of Things, so we've got intelligent bathroom scales, even fridges. We've got devices and apps. We've got high quality metadata, and the more high quality the metadata that comes with an individual, the more that the advice can be tailored to them and their needs, and the more success at the end of the day. And increasingly, we're seeing that we can get this information in real time and automatically, reducing the input from the individual, and the less the individual has to do to input this information, the more successful the outcomes. And that's why in a little while I'm going to talk about Quisper. We'll come back to that. In terms of eating for a specific genotype, there are certain requirements if you're going to try to do that. The first is that you have to have analytical validity. So that's to say that the test that tests the genotype is accurate, and we're fairly sure that those are in place. You've got to have scientific validity. So that's the link between a variant in a gene type with a specific outcome in terms of disease risk. We've got to have clinical utility, and that is that the advice that you give to someone in personalised nutrition or personalised dietary advice will lead to a beneficial outcome. And that's where there starts to be a little bit less certainty about whether or not that is true. There are also inevitably ethical, legal and societal implications. We know that certain ApoE genotypes are linked to cardiovascular risk. We know that you can intervene in that cardiovascular risk by altering dietary fats. But ApoA, that particular ApoE genotype, is also linked to the risk of dementia. And we don't yet know whether modification of dietary fats reduces that risk of dementia. And indeed, obviously, there is no treatment for dementia currently. So there are ethical issues about revealing to an individual that they may have that ApoE genotype. And then there is the question about the links with disease and health benefits can be unclear. So we know, for example, that the TT recessive genotype for MTHFR is linked to high homocysteine, and high homocysteine is an independent risk marker for heart disease. And we know that we can moderate that high homocysteine by a higher intake of folic acid. But you have to ask, if a particular genotype is leading you to a higher risk of heart disease and therefore a premature heart attack, why has that genotype persisted? What else is it doing? And is there something else we need to consider before we start manipulating those dietary intakes and in response to a particular genotype? So I don't intend to explore these, but the point that I'm making here is, in terms of single genes, we know that there are particular dietary interactions with those single genes that increase disease risk. And indeed, there are particular genes that, if we manipulate the dietary composition, will have a good outcome in terms of disease risk. Likewise, in terms of nutrigenomics, again, we know there are groups of genes, the presence of which in combination with particular dietary behaviors will increase risk of disease. And likewise, we know that groups of genes can be matched with particular dietary interventions that lead to a good and beneficial outcome for the individuals with those collections of gene and genotypes. So we know that we have a lot of the information that we need to be able to do this. The difficulty comes in how we deliver that information to the individual, since quite clearly this is not going to fit the model of a family doctor or even private healthcare on a mass population basis. Most individuals, if they're going to engage with personalised nutrition, are going to access it via SMEs that provide health and well-being apps. Unfortunately, at the moment, most dietary apps and other personalised nutrition services are not evidence-based. That wouldn't matter, except that there are huge numbers of those out there and people are engaging with them. And if the evidence and information that is being delivered to consumers is not of sound scientific value, it ultimately undermines the trust that the consumer has both in the science and also those delivering it. And when I say there are huge numbers, in 2015 there were 58,000 health and well-being apps, whether you looked on Apple Store or indeed on other Google stores, for example. In 2018 that was up beyond 300,000, and in 2021 alone 71,000 health and well-being apps were launched. So we are talking about a massive market and a massive uptake. Quisper supports delivery of evidence-based personalised dietary advice. It's been in development since originally in 2014, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. But you can see there on the right the individual organisations that have been involved with this at any particular time, as well as the funding agencies, which were EIT Food and also European funding. So how does Quisper work? Well, globally and in Europe in particular, there are thousands of food, nutrition and health resources out there. And by resources, I'm talking about data, knowledge, tools and services. Those are fed in as data providers to Quisper, and then Quisper provides that information as in acting, if you like, as a brokerage to data users who deliver it to clients. This means that we're seeing translation of research into practice, and indeed you're getting feedback from the clients to the research organisations and others that are providing this information. There's those who are providing the information are paid on terms of volume and frequency, and those who are using the information are charged per inquiry at a very low level. It works on a bulk use. So Quisper server platform, that we have services connected to it, and we've undertaken 2 use cases to test that it works in principle, and the technology readiness level has been raised to 7. So we are getting there. It is a long haul. We have a governance and oversight, so there's a non-profit association, we have the founding members, and we have a putative scientific advisory board. I say putative because they've not had tools and services to review as yet, because it's still in development. So the use cases and the business development that we looked at in 2019, we worked with an SME called My DNA Health in the UK and another called P4H in Spain, and we linked their tools and services to Quisper and then delivered them to a test group which was of older adults, and we were particularly looking at delivering lifestyle advice in the case of My DNA Health, but also some dietary advice. And in the case of P4H, we were looking at dietary advice based on their genetic information, so particular SNPs and food intake. So just to a small diversion, what's the value of personalised nutrition for the industry? I think the food industry still struggles to be on this platform to have this discussion, but we do need the industry to be part of this. And personalised nutrition offers them a number of advantages, not least that it adapts the existing models, diversifies products and defines audiences and helps exploit labelling. So it moves them from the low-cost, small margin bulk sales they currently have to an added value for products, larger margins and niche benefits. It also addresses some customers' demands, for healthy choices and easier preparation. So this is about individual lifestyles, needs and preferences. If you like, it revises the loyalty card concept, where currently you get hints for things that you've bought in the past that may or may not be good for you. And it bridges that gap between food, nutrition and health and nudges behaviours towards more healthy eating. It extends the concept of safe and nutritious food to something more evidence-based in terms of health benefits. And it moves the industry, if you like, from being perceived as the problem to being active partners in the solution. Just very quickly, Quisper in practice. It's currently part of 2 projects, one funded by EIT Food called Persfo, and the other FNS Cloud, which started in 2019. Persfo in particular, we know that adopting eating and persisting with healthy eating patterns is very hard. We live in an obesogenic environment. In particular, good intentions are undermined in the workplace. We've all done it. We go with the intention of salmon and salad and come out with chips because today has been one of those days. And we know that at the moment, health and well-being apps on the whole have a low impact on behaviour changes, particularly in the workplace. Equally, we've come to understand that gamification strategies and recommender systems have an effect in influencing actions, but they've not been widely explored in terms of eating behaviours. So we set about to do just that. Excellent timing. Set up a project that's looking at workplace eating behaviours just as you kick off into a global pandemic. However, we still pursued it. And we developed and implemented an innovative AI recommender system, delivering consumer relevant personalised food based on their canteen food service menus. And we worked with online focus groups, co-designs with food experts, and also validated by dietitians. And the advice is delivered either as nudging or suggestions or direction. And that depends on the individual's preference. Some of us like to be told what to do. Some of us just really don't. And we need to be gently nudged in the right direction. So we're currently doing a proof of principle study. It's 8 to 12 weeks, depending on the COVID-19 public health restrictions that we're dealing with at any one time. There are 3 conditions: the people using the app and just getting some general advice around healthy eating, actually using the recommender. And although it says nudging there, that should more specifically say that it's delivered either as nudging, suggestions or direction. And then we're actually personalizing that with the 3rd group, much more about their needs and their demands. We've got 3 times 70 users at all levels within the organizations, and we're using 2 companies in Belgium. And during that study, the individuals fill out a food frequency questionnaire. They fill out the Big 5 inventory and HEDEX questionnaire, which looks at their personality traits and type of behaviors, and also the intrinsic motivation intervention, which is about their subjective experiences in particular environments. During the study, they're using the app and obviously logging their choices and wants. And then post-study, they'll redo food frequency questionnaire, use SUS for the usability of the app. They'll use Rescue in terms of their opinions on the recommender system, and they'll also engage in a one-to-one 30-minute interview on user experience. So that's introduced you to Quisper. It's introduced you how personalised nutrition can be delivered to consumers. And I thank you for your attention, and we'll move on to the next speaker unless there are specific questions for me.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and for keeping in time as well. That's fantastic. Thank you. Is there any particular questions? I mean, I don't see any questions at the moment in the question and answers, but I think we can keep the questions otherwise for the end of that session, where we'll do a roundtable discussion. Pedro, maybe you can introduce the next speaker.
Okay, thank you, David. So the next speaker is a very well-known scientist, is Professor José Ordovás. He received his graduate training in Spain, and he is currently Professor of Nutrition and the Director of the Nutrition and Genomics Laboratory at the USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging, at Tufts University in Boston. He's a senior collaborating scientist at the National Center for Cardiovascular Research in Spain, and is also scientific director of In de Alimentación in Madrid. Dr. Ordovás' major research interests focus on the genetic factors predisposing to cardiovascular disease and obesity, and their interaction with the environment and behavioral factors, special emphasis on diet. But I would say also that besides being a very well-known scientist, Professor Ordovás is an experienced researcher for younger generation, as in my case. So I'm really honored to introduce Professor Ordovás. That the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you, of course, to David also and Michela. And from the perspective of the global symposium, to Luis and Ignacio that have been orchestrating all this. And to the audience, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And hopefully 2022 will drop the E from the annual symposium, and we'll be able to see each other in real life, right? Okay, so what I'm going to go over the next few minutes is kind of going a little bit deeper in terms of what Siân was telling us in terms of personalized nutrition, nutrigenetics, nutrigenomics. These are my declaration of interest, and then let's go into the matter. The reason why we are here is, in addition to our own personal interest in nutrition, is because good or bad nutrition really makes a difference on the health of the entire world. And we all have seen these numbers here on the upper right of the slide about the number of deaths related to poor nutrition, and also to the loss of quality of life years, right? So in order to advise people, recommend people what constitutes a healthy nutrition, at least in this part of the world, in the US, since the 1980s, we have seen a series of dietary guidelines for Americans every 5 years. And yeah, this is good for policy recommendations, but in terms of reaching the public, well, probably people don't read this quite often. Then we have the USDA pyramid, we have the My Plate that is more translatable to the day-to-day operations of the population at large. But despite all that, this is what we see across time, right? Oops, excuse me. Is that, for example, in the case of obesity, is on the increase, and the prediction is not very rosy. So global nutritional recommendations are not having the expected beneficial effect of reducing incidence of chronic disease. And this is not because it's not based on scientific evidence, because, for example, the dietary guidelines are based on the upper part of the pyramid of strength of scientific evidence, meaning cohort studies, randomized clinical trials, meta-analysis, and so on. However, in terms of what is the information that these people are following, well, they follow the advice of friends, family, what appears in the magazines, popular magazines like US News and World Report. So that's one of the problems that we have. The other problem is that despite the fact that we are basing the recommendations on randomized clinical trials, they are subjected to the tyranny of the averages. And this is an example of just an example of a randomized clinical trial. In this case, the purpose was to see what is going on in terms of the consumption of refined flour or wheat or wheat plus oats during 12 weeks in terms of blood pressure. So, I mean, this is a perfectly valid study, and the conclusions were that 3 portions of whole grain foods can significantly reduce cardiovascular disease in the middle-aged people that constituted the population in this study. In addition, the authors go into even provide the numbers. So if you do this, you reduce your risk of coronary artery disease of stroke by 15% or 25%. Okay, that's great. But if we take one step further and we look at the data in a different way, this is in reality what happens. We have the black arrow that is the average in blood pressure, in change in blood pressure, due to the consumption of the refined flour. And then in red and green, we have what happens in terms of reduction of blood pressure also, resulting from the consumption of whole wheat and whole wheat plus oats. Okay, so something that immediately brings the attention here is that, for example, here we have people that are consuming the refined flour, and look at the huge reductions in blood pressure that they achieve. On the other hand, you have people consuming whole wheat and oats, and look at the increases in blood pressure. So granted that statistically speaking, there was a benefit, but when it comes to the individual, we don't really know what to recommend, refined or whole wheat. And this is something that we have seen also, for example, from the studies using the microbiome, right? These paradoxical responses. So yes, we can give advice to the population at large, but we cannot, based on this kind of RCTs and similar studies, we cannot tell the individual what is best for him or her. So the question is, how we move from the traditional approach, my plate or the pyramid or whatever, to this precision nutrition plate. And one of the things that we need to incorporate is precisely these layers of omics that we have available to us now, not only in the labs, but also in terms of the public offering of part of the genetic testing and so on. So this is like the Google map, but in terms of one's or the knowledge of one individual at these different layers that go from genomics, epigenomics, metabolomics, and obviously exposomics. But what is important also is to make sure that this can be applied to real life. Back in 2010, we were dreaming about how this could be. And this is from an interview in Nature, in which I was describing that, during the next few years, that was 11 years ago, we will be feeding science with huge amounts of data. And then that will result in this fuel for each one of us on the right part of the slide. How all this started? Well, that started with the nutrigenetics that was mentioned already in the previous slide. Excuse me. The slides are jumping. Back in the 90s, we started with baby steps of genes and nutrition. As an example, we have this paper that we published in Lancet with a mutation in the A1 gene promoter and the effects on plasma LDL cholesterol that was mentioned earlier. And since then, we have been climbing, because every journey of 1,000 miles, and that's what we are doing now, begins with a single step. That's what we did. And since then, we have taken very substantial steps in terms of these nutrigenetics. And some of the papers are exemplified here on the right. One of them is this one about ApoA2, saturated fat, and interaction with and the interaction with BMI. And what we publish is that in the Framingham study, depending on your genetic makeup, whether you are CC or you are a T carrier, the effect of saturated fat intake is very different. If you are a CC, saturated fat is associated with increasing weight, but not so if you are a T carrier. The same happened in another of our studies, Golden, and also in another, both of these were in whites and another one in Hispanic, the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study, same thing. And we continue replicating these findings in Europe, in Asia, and everything was consistent, right? So this is a very interesting gene-diet interaction that could have some benefit in terms of predicting response to diet. There is one catch here, or caveat, that all this was based on observational studies, and we have to move up in the pyramid of evidence and demonstrate that this is true in terms of RCTs, and that's what we are currently doing. Another example here that I want to bring is that it's not only important what we eat, it's also important when we eat. This is another of our studies in collaboration with Marta Garolet in Murcia. And what we see is that this is an intervention study with Mediterranean diet to lose weight. And then we saw two different slopes in terms of some people were able to lose weight more than others. And the difference was not the adherence to the diet, it was when they were eating their meals. The ones that were more successful, it was early. The ones that were less successful, it was late in the day or in the morning. So one recommendation could be, well, people should be eating earlier. That will be the public health recommendation. But when we added the component of the genes, meaning nutrigenetics, this is what we found. Very interesting. If you are a T carrier of this polymorphism in the perilipin 1 gene, that is a gene very important in the adipocyte, then there is no difference when you eat. But if you are an AA carrier, you see the huge difference in response to the weight loss program, depending on the time of eating. So here we are able to loop the loop and go in beyond what to eat, whether saturated fat or not saturated fat, but also when to eat it in order to achieve the greatest impact. And there has been other examples in terms of adiposity outcomes and response to nutritional intervention, but this is beginner's luck, right? Because all of them show positive interactions and signs of very promising precision nutrition or personalized nutrition. However, other studies come to kind of muddy the waters, like is the case of diet fits, in which these people for 1 year were put in different low carbohydrate or high carbohydrate diets, and there was no difference of the diet in terms of the weight loss in the long term. And obviously, the press had a day, just saying, well, it doesn't matter what you eat, it doesn't matter your genes. And one of the problems with this study is that the genes that were studied were not related to obesity, so no surprising that they didn't give us an answer. But even when you are looking at genes very much involved with obesity, like the FTO, the meta-analysis indicates that there is something missing here, because there was no, at the end of the day, with this meta-analysis, there was no demonstration that there was a gene-diet interaction that we could take to the public and to the clinic. And this is the PREDICT study that Sarah will tell us much more in detail later. It illustrates very well why, if we just go after one omic, like is the case with genomics, we may not find the response, because in terms of the variability in response, there are so many factors. Obviously, just the biomarker that we have in circulation, the microbiome, the context of the diet, and so on and so far. And then it depends on what you're measuring, whether triglycerides or glucose in this case, left and right. What we have is that genetics, in the case of triglycerides, plays a very minor role, whereas in the case of glucose, it plays a more substantial role. But still, it doesn't define the entirety, the totality of the variability in response. And this is because with genetics or any other omics, we are looking to the landscape through a very narrow arrow slit that doesn't let us see the 360 vision that we need in order to take this personalized nutrition to the final goal that we are investigating and we are trying to achieve. So we have to incorporate other omics, as I indicated earlier. And for example, a promising one is epigenome, but this is lagging behind. Excuse me. I jump a few slides. Epigenome, it has been considered important for personalized nutrition, and especially because that association with biological aging that has been brought up in the last few years. So this is a very promising area, but still underdeveloped. We need to, what we have to do is to integrate the different omics and bring it up the ApoE2 example that I gave you before. This is what we found with genetics. Bringing epigenetics, we saw that the mechanism of this difference in response could be due to epigenetics, because when we look at the entire epigenome, what we saw is that there was a difference in signal in one of the methylation sites just next to the ApoE2 gene. We took that to transcriptomics and we saw a differential effect depending on the genotype and depending on the diet, as reflected on the upper panel, right panel. And finally, when we look at metabolism or metabolomics, yes, we saw that all that was linked at the end of this omic strip to differences in gut metabolites, vitamin 6, and tryptophan-related metabolism. So it opens a huge amount of possibilities to study with this integration and then reaching the objective of real personalized nutrition for everybody. And talking about that in terms of how we can approach this beyond what we are doing now, because I mentioned the caveats of the randomized clinical trials. Well, that can be done using the N-of-1 trials. That's apparently a new concept for some, but it started in the UK back in the 1600s, and it has followed a tortuous road in order to get to this point. And I recommend reading this paper in Advances in Nutrition, Application of N-of-1 Methods in Personalized Nutrition Research. Still, not too many studies. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you see just a handful, a few studies using this approach in terms of nutrition in general and precision nutrition in particular. In a collaboration with Westlake, we took this approach of N-of-1 trials, and then what we did was to test the glucose response using CGMs, continuous glucose monitoring, to diets that were either low-fat or high-carbohydrate diets. And what you have is different iterations of different combinations of the diets in the same individual. And these were the results. Some people were more responsive. The MPG is maximum postprandial glucose, more responses to the one type of diet, high carb or the high fat, and many people were just, it didn't matter what diet they had. So if you take the traditional approach as diet fits or so many randomized clinical trials, at the end of the day, you will get to the same conclusion, which is, okay, when you aggregate the data, it doesn't matter. You see, there is no difference in terms of the maximum postprandial glucose induced in one diet or another. But going back to the individual, this is what we have. With this approach, we are able to classify the people that are more responsive to either the high carb or the high fat diet, and those that it didn't matter. So we go beyond to the traditional approach that one size fits all and getting into the personalized nutrition that we are discussing in this session. So we have many gaps and we have many opportunities. For example, we don't know, one important component is we have to understand what we eat. This is an example also from a previous study from Sarah, in which almonds, it depends how you eat the almonds, it gives you one kind of energy intake or another. The other thing that among all these gaps and opportunities, the ones that I want to highlight is that in order to make a reality, for example, the N of 1, but also the daily use of personalized nutrition, we need real-time monitoring, meaning quantify yourself. We have to develop these gadgets that we are already using, but they have to be perfected for the use in personalized nutrition. I already showed the example of data integration in terms of omics, genomics, epigenomics, metabolomics, and so on, and obviously microbiome, in order to reach, to open that narrow window that I showed you before and look at the entire landscape of the individual. And then once we are able to identify the gaps and take advantage of the opportunities, we'll be able then to stop saying, well, it's genomics, it's epigenetics, it's whatever, and we'll be able to define the elephant in its entirety. So with this, I want to just bring you attention to this paper published by Rogers and Francis Collins, the current director, and not for very long, of the NIH, about precision nutrition, the answer to what to eat to stay healthy. And in terms of that trip of 1,000 miles, no, we are not there yet, but hopefully when we meet in a next symposium, 22, 23, 24, we'll be able to either have reached the summit or being closer to the summit. But for that, what we need is to all of us sit at the table in terms of all the different scientific expertises in order to bring the needed integration. And obviously, I want to thank ILSI Europe and ILSI Global in order to be able to provide us with that table that brings us all together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, José, for your nice presentation. And I think now, David, it's time to move forward, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. So our next and last speaker is Dr. Sarah Berry. So Sarah is a reader in nutritional science at King's College London, and she's interested in influence dietary components on cardiometabolic risk and disease, with a particular focus on postprandial metabolism and precision nutrition. Sarah has been leading more than 30 nutrition studies in cardiometabolic health, and she's also the lead nutritional scientist for the world's largest ongoing program of personal nutrition, the PREDICT study she will actually talk about today, assessing the genetic, metabolic, metagenomic, and meal-dependent effect of metabolic response to food. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for the introduction. Oh, my mic is on. Okay, sorry, just checking. And thank you, ILSI, for inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to talk about the interface of personalised nutritional science and its implementation. So build on a lot of what Siân talked about earlier and some of the flavour of things that also José covered. Declaration of interests are here for those that are interested. And I've shamelessly plagiarised, with permission, one of José's slides, where I think he nicely highlights the problem of how we go from these population average-based guidelines to the precision nutrition plate. And what I want to do is give you a flavour of what we've done with the PREDICT studies, which I hope has brought us one step closer to that summit that José has talked about. And I think a really key step in allowing us to go from these population average-based guidelines to precision nutrition is for us to really harness some really exciting opportunities that we currently have in nutritional research, as well as the broader scientific research community. And this is big data and novel technologies. And I often use this slide in presentations, but I think it really nicely highlights this transitional point that we're at in nutritional research. Now, previously, we've had to rely on either having very high quality, high precision, but low quantity studies, such as traditional randomized controlled trials, or we've relied on having these very large quantity, but very low precision studies, such as epidemiological studies. But precision nutrition can only become a reality if we can embrace both of these, if we can get scale, breadth, depth, and precision. And we can now do that because we have these big data opportunities, and we have these with the evolution of digital devices, from mobile phone apps, from clinical devices such as continuous glucose monitors, from remote clinical testing. And I'm going to give you a flavour of what we're doing with the PREDICT studies in a minute for this. But something as well is that I think is so important is the explosion of citizen scientists, the explosion of people's interest in finding out more about themselves, in using these digital devices, these clinical devices, and sharing back in their information to become citizen scientists and enhance our knowledge. And I'm going to use PREDICT as an example of how we have gone from this data collection, from implementation, and I hope we can show you with these Zoe PREDICT studies how we're using evidence-based research in the development of a personalized nutrition app. And Siân pointed out just how much this is lacking at the moment, I think, in many of those very narrow apps that are out there. So for those that aren't familiar, the PREDICT program of research is a huge ongoing program of personalized nutrition research looking at individual responses to food. It's a very unique collaboration between very traditional academics like myself at King's and some other institutions in the States, including Tufts, and we're honoured to have José also involved in this. And it's a collaboration with a startup tech company called Zoe, who are a healthcare tech company. So it's benefiting from the very fast pace of this kind of tech company, AI, machine learning knowledge, as well as the very traditional, robust approach that we take with our academic human nutrition studies. It consists of a series of studies, and unfortunately there isn't time to go into all of these. There is a website, which is the Join Zoe website, if you want to delve deeper into each of these studies. I'm going to focus on the PREDICT-1 study here on the far left, which is in 1,100 individuals. We've now hit about 10,000 individuals across our PREDICT program, all of them looking at something slightly different, but all of them have in common the focus of remote clinical testing, harnessing novel technologies and citizen science. All of them also really embrace this need to look at the integrated responses and the interrelated multi-directional pathways. We can only make precision nutrition a reality if we do that. And I love the analogy that José just used actually about how we can't look through a really narrow window to look at a huge landscape. We're hugely complicated as individuals. There's so many different responses and so many different outcomes that we need to look at, which is our landscape, but also we can't look at it through a single variable and a single exposure, which is our window. We need to look at these multiple interrelated exposures. There's some great research that's already been conducted, which José touched on some of this, and also Siân around factors such as genetics or the influence of exercise, etc. But these tend to use single exposures, single responses and single outcomes. So what we've been doing with the PREDICT program of research, which is only possible by having this scale, depth and breadth of data, is looking at these many different variables. Another thing that we've been thinking very carefully about with the PREDICT program, and I think this is really important again when we think about precision nutrition, and I'm going to touch on this in a little bit more detail when I talk about some work we've been doing on glucose dips as well, that we also need to ensure that we're not sticking to what are the traditionally accepted measures all the time, that actually we need to look beyond this, because there might be some different measures that are more important when it comes to different outcomes exposures, and I'll touch on that in a few minutes. So something that we've been particularly interested in is looking at chronic but also postprandial responses. For those that aren't familiar, I've shown you a typical postprandial response on the left here following a mixed meal. So if you consume carbohydrates in a meal, you have this very short, sharp rise in glucose, peaking at 30 minutes, returning to baseline around 2 hours. The fat in a mixed meal causes a slower, more blunted increase in circulating plasma triglycerides, peaking around 4 hours, returning to baseline anywhere between 6 to 8 hours. Now, if we map this onto a typical day where we consume multiple meals throughout the day, we spend most of our day in this state of metabolic flux with these short, sharp rises in glucose and this prolonged stepwise almost elevation in plasma triglycerides. And the reason this is important is because typically we focused on fasting levels. So typically you're asked to go to the doctor, come in fasted, we'll measure your blood lipids. But you can see we spend nearly 18 hours of the day in this state of metabolic flux. And this initiates a whole cascade of downstream effects, culminating in an inflammatory response, oxidative stress, hemostatic dysfunction, and lipoprotein remodeling. And so this is really important because we know if this is sustained and repeated over the day, that it can have unfavorable health effects. And so what we've been doing with the PREDICT study is trying to look at a broad window, thinking back to what José was saying, at the bigger landscape. So looking at many input exposures and also many outcome variables. Apologies if you can hear beeping in the background, but there's now some building work going on outside my house, and there's a lot of noise erupting, so I do apologise. Okay, so from a practical point of view, how do we achieve this? How do we look at loads of different determinants and loads of different outcomes? Well, I'm going to focus on the PREDICT-1 study, like I mentioned, to illustrate how we can do this from a practical sense. So in the PREDICT-1 study, this consisted of a main cohort where we had 1,002 individuals who were predominantly from the Twins UK cohort. So about 70% of these were either identical or non-identical twins. And we had a validation cohort in the US at MGH of 100 individuals. And we combined a very traditional, tightly controlled clinic day, very typical of the kind of postprandial test days that I've used over the last 20 years in my studies at King's College London, and the kind of studies also that José's been conducting in his unit. And then we had a 2-week at-home phase. The baseline clinic day consisted of people attending our clinic fasted. We gave them sequential test meal challenge, which was high in fat and carbohydrate, and we took sequential blood samples over a 6-hour period. We also took lots of other measures. So we measured their body composition using DEXA, BMI, etc. We asked people to complete a whole host of different questionnaires, from food frequency questionnaires to medical lifestyle. We measured blood pressure, heart rate, and we use these blood samples to measure everything from genetics to metabolomics. We also collected stool and saliva for similar omic analysis. Participants then entered a home phase, and this 2-week home phase is very similar to the home phase that we've used in all of our subsequent studies, the ones that I mentioned where we have about 10,000 people, but it's also the foundation for the actual Zoe product, which is this personalised nutrition product that's evolved out of this research. During the at-home phase, we capitalise on citizen science, we capitalise on these novel technologies. Participants are fitted with continuous glucose monitors, physical activity monitors. We provide them with dry blood spot testing equipment, so we can look at triglycerides and C-peptide. And over the 2-week period, participants have in duplicate standardised test meals that we baked and deliver to them that differ in nutrient composition, so in the amount of fat, carbohydrate, protein, fibre, for example. They consume these in the morning, and after a certain period of fasting, they're then free to continue their free living self-selected meals. And a really key component of this, and it's also a key component of the personalised nutrition product that's arisen from this, is the dietary assessment app that we've built. And this dietary assessment app allows a combination of weighed records, photos, barcoding. So everything is that participants are eating is recorded at a really high quality. It's monitored in real time by a team of nutritionists at Zoe or on an app. And we also use it to measure other outcomes such as satiety and hunger. So we're collecting really high resolution data, but still at scale. Just to give you an idea of the scale, again, this is just for our 1,100 from the PREDICT study. We had 32,000 muffins, which are our standardized test meals, consumed in this study. We had 2 million glucose readings recorded, 750,000 metabolomic measures, 132,000 meals logged, and so forth. And this provides us with a huge database from which we can really start to unravel what's determining differences in our response to food. And you can see the huge differences in our response to food here, which I think really highlights something again that José mentioned about the tyranny of using the average or the mean response. So on your left, you can see the postprandial triglyceride response with the concentration on the y-axis and the time from 0 to 6 hours on the x-axis, and the same for the glucose on your right. And this is just from the clinic day. This is in our really tightly controlled clinic day where we don't have any of those other variables that influence our postprandial responses, such as how we, which I'll come on to mention. You can see the mean and median response is shown by the red and blue line, and each one of these black lines is an individual's response, just really highlighting what both Siân and José have talked about, that there is huge variability between how we respond, even in tightly controlled setting. So what's causing this difference in variability, and is it all in our genes? Well, this is what we've been delving into over the last year, trying to tease out all of these different exposures and determinants. Like I mentioned, we're very fortunate that a large part of our cohort were twins. So what we were able to do is have a look at how much is due to genetics, upbringing and environment using ACE heritability modelling, which is shown down here. But I think what really nicely illustrates this visually is when we plot one identical twin against another identical twin, as we've done here for height on the left, you can see if it's all due to our genetics, as it is mainly with height, you get this beautiful straight line. If, however, genetics isn't the key determinant, you'll have your dots more scattered around, as you see we have for both glucose and triglycerides, showing that genetics don't explain most of the nutritional differences. They play a role, but a small role. So what we've been doing is looking at all of these multiple exposures, looking at multiple responses and multiple outcomes. And there isn't time for me to go through all of these different exposures, but we've explored all of these, and I'll just pick out a couple really to spend the last 5 minutes to focus on. A kind of top line level of what we found is that how we respond to food can be categorized into 3 broad categories. It can be what we eat, obviously, so the foods that we're consuming, the nutrients that we're consuming, the dietary patterns. Also how we eat, and by how we eat, we mean the kind of context of our meals. So the time of day, the meal sequencing, how much sleep we've had, how much exercise we've had. And this is something we've been spending a lot of time looking at more recently. And we've got some really exciting results coming out on this. And also who we are, so our age, our sex, you know, are we premenopausal or postmenopausal? These are all factors that we find modulate our response to food and really highlight how we need to look at these many different factors when we're thinking about how we can implement precision nutrition. We can also do this in a stratified way, and I want to just show you one of the results of the kind of stratified work that we've been doing. And Siân mentioned earlier about the different levels that we can go to get to precision or personalised nutrition, and she mentioned about grouping and stratified nutrition. And so just to give you an example, when we look at how time of day impacts our responses to food, we know from previously published research that if you consume high carbohydrate meals in the afternoon, you have a worse, so a higher glycemic response than if you consume them in the morning. We also see in our own data that there's huge variability. And when we try and look at what's causing this variability in this time of day effect, what we see is that your age is a big factor. So we see that time of day is really important in younger individuals, but as you get older, it's less important, which might be just because they have poorer glycemic control anyway as you get older. But how does this apply to something practical? Well, maybe when we're thinking about giving people advice on time of day, we should focus on younger individuals, perhaps, and not older individuals. And this is a way we can apply personalized advice, but in a kind of using a stratified approach as well. We also see that meal order impacts our responses. In the interest of time, I'm going to really quickly whiz over this, but really I just want to highlight that we've done a sub-study where we fed people a whole host of different breakfasts. We've given them an identical meal for lunch, and what we find is your postprandial response at lunch is actually predetermined by whatever it is you're having at breakfast. And I want to use this really to highlight again the complexity of all of these different factors we need to think about in precision nutrition, and why it's really important, like Siân said, that we have to be evidence-based. We can't just take single exposures, and build a personalized nutrition product out of that. Okay, so José showed this figure earlier, and this is really the summation of where we've got to with looking at some of our different exposures and looking at how the ranking of different exposures differ depending on the response we're looking at. So if you look at on the left, what we've done is we've ranked and these are R-squared values. We've ranked the different exposures' importance in determining the postprandial glucose response, and on the right, determining the postprandial triglyceride response. And what's important to note here is different exposures have different strengths of associations depending on the outcome. So again, depending on what outcome we want to focus on in personalized nutrition will determine what exposure we might want to focus on modifying. Now, another point that I want to come back to, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is that we need to also think about what features of the response we want to measure, and we need to move beyond just using typically accepted features. And I'm using glucose as an example here because there's an explosion in the use of continuous glucose monitors at the moment, and there's a whole question around whether this is useful in healthy people or not. Now, we know that the response curve is complicated, whether this is for glucose or any other outcome. And I've very simply illustrated here what we would consider to be probably a healthy response, which is the blue line, and an unhealthy response, which is the red line. And if we were to map this across a day, and again, I've kind of tried, this is quite a simplistic approach, but it's to illustrate my point that there's many different outcomes that we could take from this. We could look at the peak concentration, we could look at the dip, we could look at the area under the curve, or we could look at the variability in responses. But what our research is showing is what feature we want to look at is dependent on the outcome we're interested in. So, for example, we're finding that looking at the peak response is really informative when it comes to looking at postprandial inflammation. And yet we're finding looking at this dip is really important when it comes to looking at hunger or energy intake. And this is nicely illustrated in a paper that we recently published, where we separated people according to whether they were big dippers or little dippers. And what we found was that those that were big dippers, so had this big postprandial dip, irrespective of the peak glucose concentration, had a really big increase in hunger. They consumed their meal on average 30 minutes before the next person, before a small dipper. They consumed about 80 calories more in their next meal, which was an ad libitum self-selected meal. And this equated over a day to about 300 extra calories for those that were big dippers versus little dippers. And I wanted to just add this in really to show you again the complexity of really achieving precision nutrition, particularly at a product level. So to finish up, it's only right that I should quickly mention where the microbiome fits in. I am conscious of time, but as I started a few minutes late, I will stick to the 20 minutes that I'm allocated, but it means we are going to go about 2 minutes over the time for the session. So I'll wrap up in these last few minutes by really just touching very briefly on the work we've been doing on the microbiome and how then we brought all this together in a product. So there's a wonderful review out there by my colleague Ana Valdez that really summarizes just how important the microbiome is in health and disease. And we've been exploring this in the PREDICT program of research. And what we find is, firstly, that our microbiome is hugely variable. So, for example, twins share about 34% of the DNA of their microbes, and unrelated individuals about 30%, showing that twins actually only share a tiny bit more. We also know from previously published research and also our own research that there's a close link between the microbiome and diet and health. And what we've been able to do is identify microbes that are associated with favourable or unfavourable measures of health. And we found that these are also associated with favourable or unfavourable measures of diet. So we've developed this microbiome signature of what I very loosely call our good and our bad bugs. And this is published in a Nature Medicine paper that came out a couple of months ago. Okay, so how do we take all of this information and translate it into dietary advice? Well, we can use the machine learning expertise and build prediction algorithms. And then what we can do is we can combine and refine from all of our ongoing PREDICT studies to assess which exposures are important and develop a personalized score. And this is translated using a real evidence-based approach, in my opinion, to the Zoe program, where people are provided with this personalized nutrition product. I'm whizzing through this last slide just in the interest of time, but as I said, for those that are interested in finding out more, please do go to the Join Zoe website. So what's the future of personalised nutrition? Well, we have all of these amazing opportunities that I mentioned with digital devices, remote technologies. We know that everyone's unique. Now we need to think about how we can impact health. And I think Siân really nicely summarised this earlier. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you, ILSI, for inviting me here today.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a great talk. We are a bit squeezed with time. We are out of time, but I think we're going to summarize quickly. Pedro, I think you want to introduce your study as well very quickly.
Yes, thank you, David. First of all, thanks to all the speakers for the nice presentation. Yeah, one of the points we wanted to introduce in this meeting was also that you can do personalized nutrition with other views. I mean, so far we have been talking mainly about nutrients, but also, you know, for the industry, bioactive compounds, secondary compounds, polyphenols, for instance, or other plant bioactives are very important and are key for new personalized nutrition adventures. In line or within that frame, so far I lead in an ERC project. It is called Predict Care. Has nothing to do with the Predict studies that Sarah mentioned before. It's an ERC starting grant, focus on the prediction of cardiometabolic response upon consumption of food of dietary polyphenols. You know that at the time you are metabolizing the polyphenols you have in foods, let's say tannins, let's say isoflavone from soy, or many other dietary polyphenols. Every people metabolize them in a different way, and the cardiometabolic response may change. So far, we don't know nothing about the diet rich in polyphenols and the different effects that any single individual that may have. And that's the aim of this Predict Care project is about trying to understand how every individual metabolize polyphenols, how that may impact on the cardiometabolic response of every single individual, and at the end of the day, try to develop personalized diets and nutrition plans in order to try to improve as much as possible without major changes in the diet of every individual, try to improve their health. So, and I wanted to introduce this also to connect to one of the first question. I think we have just one question in the panel, but I will introduce a first question that is related to that for Sarah or for José, for instance. So far, you have been doing personalized nutrition, in the case of José, mainly a stratified nutrition approach, personalized approaches. In the case of Sarah, it's a more precision nutrition approach. But most of the time, we are focused on postprandial responses. While probably in order to have a sustained effect on health, we should move toward robust cardiometabolic endpoints, the ones you usually study in any cohort study, no? So, Sarah, José, do you think that there is an opportunity for chronic biomarker of cardiometabolic health to be used when you are not using nutrients, but when you are using secondary compounds as polyphenols or carotenoids or any other bioactive?
Oh, well, obviously what we want to fix is not the intermediate biomarker, right? As the bottom line is the disease itself, right? And I should say that although I didn't present the data, from the PREDIMED study in collaboration with Dr. Corella, we demonstrated that even in people at high risk, even in people that are older, the fact that they, yes, in the randomization, they fall on the right group for their genotype, right? That prevented, in this case, strokes, the incidence of a stroke, right? During the duration of the PREDIMED study. So this is a very important study precisely to demonstrate that with, let's call it personalized, let's call it precision, let's call it tailor, whatever name you want to give it, but beyond the one size fits all, in one study that one diet was healthy against another diet that was healthy, still genes were important, not only to modify glucose levels, whether fasting, postprandial, whatever, but at the end of those 5 years, a very significant number of events cardiovascular events were prevented because people in the Mediterranean diet with the TCF7L2 risk genotype were spared of having a stroke event. So very important message, and also indicating that prevention never is too late, because these were old people, right?
Any other speaker want to add something, or we should move to the next question? Okay, David. You are mute, David. Okay. I think, David, you are mute, so we cannot hear you.
Yes,
Okay,
you're absolutely right. I was saying we are pressed by time. Sessions are going to start. The other sessions are going to start. I would advise maybe if anybody in the audience has any question, maybe to direct those directly to ILSI Europe, and we will either send those to the speakers, or you can contact the speakers directly as well if you have any pressing questions. But I know the other sessions are going to start in 1 minute. So unfortunately, we will have to end this great session. I would like to thank all the speakers for their time and great talks. It was really interesting, and then providing a lot of information for us, food for thought, like we say, for advancing this very important topic for the next decade also. Thank you very much indeed, and hope to see you soon all. And I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.